Welcome back, podcast fans. I'm your host, Annette Hines, and this is Parenting Impossible, the Special Needs Survival Podcast. Today, I'm here with Christa Preston, and I'm so excited to introduce you to her. It's just another example of how someone can have an idea and create something that literally changes the world. So I'm so excited that Christa's here. Let me just tell you a little bit about Christa. First of all, I'm so grateful that Marcy Randall introduced us. So Marcy was on my podcast last year, I think, and we have since become really good friends. And she's been helping me with this podcast, helping me get very interesting and wonderful people booked for the show. And as a result, Christa is here. Christa is the executive director and founder of Embrace Kulture, spelled with a K, which is an organization that's focused on building capacity of other organizations that serve children and youth with developmental and cognitive disabilities in Uganda and also across East Africa. I know, amazing already, but wait, there's more. She started this organization, which has now spread this incredible message of acceptance and inclusion to over 1 million Uganda people. And this was in honor of a family member who she'll tell us more about, who had severe cognitive and physical disabilities and who unfortunately passed away, something we have in common. In this organization, Embrace Kulture, Christa manages multi-country, multidisciplinary working teams, and they're composed of academic experts from local and international nonprofit organizations and individuals that are directly impacted by the work. She's recognized as an Ashoka changemaker, hooray, and her program innovations have been featured by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's based in Boston, and I just want to add one little thing because I know that's like the official, but what she's been able to do to take what love and acceptance and life experience she had with her family member, her brother, and bring that forward into these African communities. And also this tiny little community in Holliston, which she's going to tell you about. It's a small town in Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, and take inclusion and acceptance to a global level. So this is so impactful for me and very motivating. Christa, thank you for coming on the show. So excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I have never been on a podcast before, so this is going to be
Oh,
an excellent little adventure.
this is nothing. This is like having coffee with a friend. No big deal here. So tell us a little bit more about your brother and your experience that you had with him. And by the way, it's been a minute. Krista and I have been scheduling and rescheduling each other. She's been really sick. She's feeling better now, but it's been a minute since we've been able to get this together. So we're so glad to be here right now.
Yes, yes, and thank you so much for, yeah, I am unfortunately someone impacted by long COVID from a very mild case in December 2022. And now when I get sick, which most recently was another case of COVID, I just get very, very sick, which has actually been an interesting experience in all of my disability work because I've actually been diagnosed with a disability due to long COVID
Right.
recently in 2023. So having these limitations on my own body has really helped me understand what the children that we've been working with go through. But we will get to all of that. I'll first start with my family story. So I've always referred to him as my brother. His name is Nick. He's actually biologically my uncle, so my mother's brother. But by the time I was born, he was already living in our household. My parents were his guardians. So he's been my brother my whole life. He has severe physical and cognitive impairments. If you would meet him, you would think he wouldn't be able to communicate because he doesn't have speech. But as many of our families, who I'm sure are your podcast listeners, understand, communication is many different forms.
Yeah.
So we could fully understand what he was saying to us, but someone popping into the house might be a bit taken aback, trying
Right.
to figure out where he's coming in. And he was very obviously, if you saw him, you would recognize that he had a disability, which, growing up in that household, I didn't realize that I had a filter of if good people were coming into my home or not. It
Yeah.
wasn't something I realized what was happening, but my friends that I've had from my childhood have been my best friends my whole life. And when I was older, I realized it's because if you came into our house and you
Mhm.
were willing to be part of the chaos that was our family, you were a great person. So I always wondered, I would hear my friends talk about the drama they'd have with other friends, and I just never experienced that. And finally realized so much of that was him and his influence on my life. Um, and I know your listeners are going to understand this as well. When you're growing up, when you have someone so severely impacted in your family, that is your focus. That is where your mind is all the time, because you have to be thinking about, we would go bowling every Wednesday. Well, where's the oxygen? How are we going to get the wheelchair into the car? How are we going to get the wheelchair out of the car? What food do we need to make sure is in the house? Because if we don't have the specific item on the specific day, he's going to have a fit about it.
Yeah.
So just always being aware and planning a million steps ahead just became
Yes.
who we were. Like, that was just our life. And there were a lot of challenges with that, but there were a lot of amazing benefits. Like, our family was tight, and not just our family, but our extended family. I have a million cousins, and we would all get together for all the holidays because they all wanted to be around and supportive of Nick. So I really grew up in a very positive environment.
Mhm.
And I think it's also very important to note the distinction between being a sibling to someone with a disability versus being a
A
parent or
parent.
caretaker. That level of responsibility, that I hate to use this term, but what a lot of people feel as burden,
Mhm.
doesn't happen in the sibling relationship, because, one, disability didn't happen to me. It's all I ever knew. He was in my family before I was in my family. So
Yeah.
it wasn't, a single event that shocked us. It was just, this is what it is. And the things that, like, when he would get upset in public, that would be, a caretaker looks at that as something they're so concerned about because they feel the responsibility to address how upset he is, or worry
Right.
about the people around and upset. When you're a sibling, you're just like, well, they're at it again.
And I'm going off with my friends.
Yep. And or just like, it's happening in the grocery store and you're like, oh, now I can sneak the cereal that I want in here and no one's
There
gonna
you
know.
go.
'Cause so he was a huge, huge influence in my life while he was alive, and then became just a driving factor in my life after he passed away.
Mm. And when was that?
So he passed away in November 2012. And if you don't mind, I'll segue a little bit with a funny story of
Sure.
with his disability, he was severely medically compromised. So he
Mhm.
was on oxygen all the time. And I would say every 5 years or so, since he was 2 years old, we would have doctors tell us, okay, this is it. This is the end. Nick is going to pass away. This is the end. And the whole family would come together to say our final goodbyes
Mhm.
every 5 years. And I believe he was 54 when he finally passed away. So we had said our goodbyes a lot, and it was always very dramatic. So he would have a sudden stroke, and not be able to have food, and that's where it would happen. But when he actually passed away, it was very, very peaceful. It was in his sleep. The doctors had not told us anything. He had just decided that he was ready to go. Um, Unfortunately, when he did, I had grown up, gotten married, and moved to California.
Oh.
And when he passed, it hit me suddenly that there was this disability community that had been my life
Mhm.
that I hadn't been a part of at all. Since I moved out of my house, I wasn't volunteering in disability organizations. I just had this amazing community
Yeah.
that I had left. And
Mhm.
so when he passed away, I was determined to get back to that community. And
Wow.
and for some reason, I always really wanted to be part of that community outside of America and
Yeah.
see what it was like there. Because we did have this experience with Nick that was he lived in our home for most of my life, but eventually we did transition him into a group home, which
Oh.
there can be a lot of negatives around that, but we found so many positives. And one of the big ones was how independent he felt. So he would get to
Mm.
show off his bedroom and show off his house and his kitchen. And he was
Mhm.
so proud. And that stuck with me in in a guilty way, actually, because I wondered what else had we denied him, thinking we were doing what was best for him.
Oh.
And so I really wanted to go abroad to where this idea of independence wasn't an option. Like you had to be independent. There weren't supports around you. So when he passed away, I started to make a plan that I was going to go abroad and volunteer in the disability space. I had
Mhm.
no idea of where I was going to do that or what I was going to do specifically, but I knew I wanted to do that to honor his memory and to reconnect with the community. And
Yeah.
that is how I ended up in Uganda.
So tell me about that first trip.
Yeah, that was pretty wild. I had never traveled alone before. Um,
Mm.
I don't I don't know if I'd even been alone, overnight more than a handful of times in my life at this point. I
Mhm.
was also newly married. My husband and I had been together for about a year at this point, and I just came home from work one day and said, you know what, this has been on my mind. I'm doing this. I'm doing this now. I'm sitting down, I'm booking my flight. I had a friend on Facebook that I hadn't spoken to in 6 years,
Mm.
also from Holliston, and she happened to be in Uganda. And I was searching online for, volunteer in the
Yeah.
disability space abroad. Nothing existed. I went to Peace Corps. They were like,
Oh my God.
we can't guarantee you're going to be in the disability space. You could be in water or power. So I reached out to her and she immediately responded, I have a school for you to volunteer out. Come to Uganda. And I went online and I booked my flight. And it was when I was flying out there, I was about 30 minutes from landing that it kind of hit me what I was doing. And I started to panic saying, I don't know. I don't know if who's going to pick me up at the airport. I don't know how I'm going to get in touch with them. I don't know how to call somebody. I don't know what this school is going to be like. I don't know what living by myself and not knowing anybody in an entire country is going to be like.
Yes.
So it was very, very intimidating. But we also had this one experience in my family, or saying in my family, that if you were someplace and you saw a rainbow, that was Nick telling you you are where you're supposed to be. Like he's looking out for you and he's guiding you. So I remember thinking to myself, when I would get off the plane in Uganda, I would have to take a picture and quickly send it to a friend to Photoshop to put in rainbows so that mom would feel comfortable
Mhm.
about being, on the other side of the world. And the plane landed and I got off and I didn't have to ask for the Photoshop because there were rainbows. It had just rained and there were rainbows scattered absolutely everywhere.
Wow.
So I knew the moment I stepped off, this is where I was supposed to be. And he would help me
Mm.
figure out whatever I had to do to figure out. So that was my my landing experience in Uganda. And then I had my first day at school.
Oh,
Again, I so appreciate your listeners because they're going to understand this. I've told this story to countless people who are just like, why is 32 a big number? But I walked into the school and I was going to be a classroom aide. And I walked into my classroom and it was 34 children with severe learning needs and behaviors who in the US would have had one-on-one supports.
yeah.
And this was one teacher. At that time, they didn't have an aide, so it was one teacher and 34. And when I am saying the curriculum, the lesson plan for the day was survive. It was
Oh my gosh.
just get through the day with all of our fingers and toes intact. It was, I mean, absolutely, absolutely wild to be in this classroom with so much happening. Because I mean, I think we had a cement floor. We were like a step above a dirt floor classroom. There were no materials. There were no pencils. There were no papers. There were no communication tablets. There was just a classroom full of kids and a blackboard.
Mm.
And we were going to learn one way or another. And that was it made me appreciate a lot of the advances that we have made here in the US. But I will also say, seeing these students together, especially during the free time out on the playground, I have never seen such levels of social engagement
Mm.
before. Like the friendships that developed, the way they all cared for one another, because there weren't enough teachers, there weren't aides. If
Right.
somebody fell and got hurt, it was another student that went over and addressed the issue. If somebody had this of course happened, somebody grabs somebody's food, you have a student that has behaviors and part of the behaviors is wanting to eat everything. So they're
Mhm.
running around the playground grabbing the food from everybody and that's upsetting some of the students. So who's going to console those students? It's other students. And who's going
Wow.
to reprimand the boy who's running around eating everything?
Yeah.
It's other students. So that was just wild to see the friendships that they would create, but also the
Community.
caretaker
It's,
role. The community that was there and the caretaker role that they
yeah.
took on themselves.
That's really interesting because I can see you paint such a good picture, and I can see in my mind that this small group of students has really bonded in a true
Mm-hmm.
community that supports each other. And um, because they are not given all the adult supports, they are
Mm-hmm.
allowed to, no barriers, no boundaries. They're allowed to form these friendships and relationships with each other. When I think about the classrooms that we have here that do have the one-to-one, children are not really bonding. It's
Mm-hmm.
all adult child, adult child. And I found that a lot. As you were describing your brother,
Mm-hmm.
that was my daughter Elizabeth, and she loved other kids, but there were so many barriers to her being able to have true relationships, really
Mm-hmm.
give and take relationships with other students and with other children in the neighborhood, because there was always a nurse, there was always an aide, there was always a therapist, and they would speak for her and speak over her. And, it took away her need to communicate, even though she still wanted to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just listening to your story and thinking through a lot of things. getting a picture of how different it is, but maybe not so awful in some ways, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely, I would say the thing that stuck out to me was peers. And what does peer mean? Because
Mm-hmm.
so often it gets put into like an age group and pushing
Right.
students to higher and higher levels to keep them with their age group. Whereas here, I mean, the classroom that I was in, we had students that were 8 and we had students that were 18, but they were
Wow.
cognitively at the same level. They were learning the same things because that's where they all were. And so seeing who came together was different than what I'd seen because we didn't have these age brackets. So you might see two people who became best friends, again, one 14 years old, one 8 years old. And they had that opportunity on this playground because there was that freedom to just say, who, we're not going to define who your peer is. We're going to let you pick who your peer is.
Interesting. What about inclusion with other non-disabled students? Was any of that happening?
Inclusion is not, at that time in Uganda, inclusion was not on the table.
Okay.
Uh, in schools, the way the Ugandan system was set up was there are special schools. So
Hmm.
if a child has a physical disability, there could be opportunities for inclusion. It was tend to be thought of in terms of like physical accessibility to a school is inclusion. But when it came to learning supports, the resources just are not there. The education for teachers just is not there. So special schools were set up and children were put into special schools. And one other thing to note is in Uganda, any school, any child typically goes to a boarding school. So they will stay overnight for a 3-month term. So these
Oh,
special schools were boarding facilities as well. So the students were really only interacting with each other, surrounded by a compound wall. I mean, a big wall that went up. So it was inclusion was whoever was coming onto the compound. That's what the level of inclusion
okay.
was. Now they would have to leave school and then go into the community.
Hmm.
Um, and that's where I learned, I spent my entire first year just in the school system. And after that first year, I had a similar question. I wanted to see what inclusion was in the community,
Hmm.
thinking, it's something we can do more in schools. We just need to do trainings for teachers. We need to talk to government about what inclusion is. We just need to, kind of adjust these definitions and put structures in place to allow inclusion to happen at all mainstream schools. So I worked with a social worker and we followed one of the students back to their village to see what integration and inclusion was like back in their village. And that is when the reality hit me. And the reality in Uganda was children with special needs are considered curses. They are considered evil spirits. And when they go home, are put into a room and hidden from the rest of their community because the parents truly believe that this is a sign that someone has come against them, that someone has put a curse on their family, or truly that their child has an evil spirit inside of them and they're afraid of that and they don't know what to do with that. So that was something I had heard but not something I understood until I saw it. And then in a few other instances we would find in later years of me working there, some of the children we found in the community were actually tied to a post in the ground. So, a post would be put down, they would have a rope tied to them. They were, visible to the community, which was a big change from what we had been seeing. And when we approached those parents and said, though, you can't tie up your kid, what are you doing here? they would say, and we tend to see this more with children with autism, they would say, my child wanders. They wander, and we don't have a home where they will stay inside. Like, we don't have a door that we can lock.
Mm.
We don't have a center that we can take them to. So when we go to work, that child is on their own and originally had been wandering around into the road, could get hit by a car, could get somebody from the community to take them away. So the parents' best solution as they saw it was to tie the child up to at least keep them, what they considered keeping them safe. And it was, I mean, just beyond eye-opening to really talk to these parents and see the difficult decisions that they were facing of, I understand that I shouldn't be doing this to my child, but what other option do I have? And that's what drove a lot of our work, was when we got out into the community and saw what was happening, and how we could start with inclusion at the home and in the community and eventually build towards inclusion at the schools.
Wow. My heart is breaking.
I know
It
it
hurts to think about that.
it was wild to see, and the stories that we heard from parents were just unbelievably painful, unbelievably painful. Um, but we also saw the other side of it, which was social workers would work with me, and we would go into these communities and we would just do basic education. This is what autism is. This is what Down syndrome is. Show pictures. Talk about the needs of these children and how the community could help. And we would have these sessions. They'd be like a community awareness event where we would have, literally, we'd say, meet under the mango tree, bring any parent you know that has a kid with special needs. The parents truly did not know what was happening with their child. So they would come to this meeting, we probably would have 10 or 15 people at the beginning of this meeting. And by
Yeah.
the end of this meeting, we would have 100 people and 30 kids who were suddenly brought forward into the community because
Mm.
the family didn't know what was happening and now they did. And the community didn't know how to support and now they did. And we would do about 6 months of integration work with one community at a time.
Okay.
And it worked. Like, these simple awareness meetings changed completely how the family and the community interacted with this individual.
Mm.
It is a village life there. It is a communal life there. You
Right.
support your neighbor. If you have something extra, you give it out to your community. And once they understood what these disabilities were, they understood their responsibility as a community to support these
Wow.
children. And
Okay.
yes, it, it was like just beautiful to see as these parents, hesitantly brought these children forward. And then 6 months later, we'd show up back at the village and the kid would be out there playing with everybody else. Just, you drive up and everybody's out there together. And it seemed like such a short time compared to here in the US.
Right.
We are fighting for decades
Yes.
for different levels of inclusion and different support systems to pass. Just because we are at a different position, a different level than they're at there.
Yeah, we don't have that strong sense of community. You
Mhm.
know, it's very much like what I do in my house is my business, what you do in your house is your business. And there's obviously there's a sense of, you know, a sense of community, a sense of welcoming and working together in the disability community to a certain extent. But I have talked with other people from different countries around the world, and I think the, quote unquote westernized countries
Mhm.
are just having a harder time of this whole inclusion model. because we just don't do close-knit communities
Mhm.
anymore. We just don't have that. So, how many years did you go back and forth and do this work before you started your venture, your own organization?
So I started the first organization, which there was a single organization through it, but it went through a few different chapters and expansions. I started after the first year. So when I had decided to go to Uganda in the beginning, I was going to commit to 1 year.
Hmm.
And after the first year, that's when I had gone into the community and found out what was happening. So
Mm,
I knew right then and there I had to do something. Um, I knew I had connections to the US. I knew I could find funding somehow. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I would be able to find it. And I knew
sure.
that I'd be able to bring those resources over and do something. So I started what at that point was called the Oliva Project, really inspired by this one girl, Oliva, who's the one I had followed into the community. Um, I also had to call my wonderful husband at that point and tell him this 1 year commitment that I made is not going to be 1 year, and I don't know how long it's going to be. And I
Wow.
actually ended up, uh, it was started as the Oliva Project. That was 2013. Then we became Embrace Culture, and I went back and forth, majority out there in Uganda for 7 years. So finally came back right as the pandemic closures were happening. And that was just my transition back to the US. So I'm still on the board and very much involved with the organization, but I'm also really, really happy to say that it is still active in Uganda as a completely Ugandan-led organization.
Yeah.
So there's staff on the ground who are going out and doing absolutely incredible work, which freed me up a little bit, and the board to help build the capacity of other organizations in East Africa through what we have learned to be able to do more inclusive work. So yeah, 7 years back and forth, and
Wow.
it's I haven't been actually back since I came out here in 2020. So it's been
Wow.
interesting to be fully back here.
Well, tell me a little bit about how your tiny little town of Holliston has gotten involved in such a global
Yes.
issue.
So, for those familiar with Holliston, hello. There probably aren't
Mhm.
too many of you because Holliston is a small town of 10,000 people. And growing up in a small town, wonderful experience. You know everybody, everybody knows you. And I actually personally that worked for me. I really enjoyed my time in Holliston. And I also found Holliston to be very unique in the sense that we did have more of that community
Yes.
experience than I have found since Holliston. I've lived mostly in cities, and you definitely don't have that experience
Yeah,
in the cities.
for sure.
So when I was in Africa and seeing what was happening on the ground, I knew I had to come back and raise money and bring that money out back to Africa. But here's the thing: when you are a family profoundly affected by disability, you
Mhm.
are worried about so many things. Your
Mhm.
mind is consumed completely by what your family needs. You can
Mhm.
only think that far. And then when you are similarly a small town in America, you can think about what your family needs and what your community needs, but
Right.
you can't really think too far beyond that. And suddenly I was showing up, not knowing where else to turn because I had never done fundraising before. And I had 1 month to be in the US to raise money and take it back. So I just put out a call to anybody I knew in Holliston, and I said, we're going to have an event supporting kids with disabilities on the other side of the country, like,
Yeah.
sorry, on the other side of the world. You literally couldn't, if you look on a globe, you can't get farther from Holliston to where we were in Uganda. And so we sent out invitations, saying, come to the town hall. We're going to have this fundraising event. We didn't know if anybody was going to show up. We didn't know if people showed up, if they were going to even want to donate or even care about what was happening. And the town hall from the first event was
Wow.
completely full. And that was just our first event. So I raised enough money that I knew I could go back and start a program in Uganda. And then I would come back once a year. We would have an annual event in Holliston.
Yeah.
And every time I came back, more and more of the community came out and they gave more and more. I would share the stories and share videos of what they were doing, but
Mhm.
they couldn't really see it. They were here to support a community member and what
Mm.
that community member was going to do. And through that, they ended up impacting over 1 million people in a in a country as
Wow.
far away as one can possibly get to a population that no international funders existed. There were there were zero organizations working on these more severe disabilities in the African context. We were the first ones. We
Wow.
today are the biggest ones. And even now, it's still a majority of our funding comes from that Holliston community, many who have moved beyond just the town itself. Uh,
Yeah.
but really, truly, I mean, the impact of this town, it started with direct lives. Like there were individuals that I could say, hey, you helped this person or you helped this child, and that was amazing. But then it got to the national level. And through the funding we got from Holliston, we actually were able to we did a human rights lawsuit against the government of Uganda. We won. We got put in place new guidelines and services at a national level that have made inclusion actually
That's so
inclusion.
awesome. So
Uh,
cool, so awesome. Who did
it's
you join with to do that?
so we did a lot of work. So we have a board that's actually still based with Holliston individuals. They provided expertise on how to develop an organization and then links to other organizations like Perkins International, we've been linked with. We have worked with Autism Speaks. We've worked with Global Autism Project. And then we also pulled together um, local experts and international experts into these working groups to say, this has never been done before. No one has
Right.
made what does inclusion look like for children with autism in Africa. No one had created that standard, that playbook.
Yes.
So we pulled together all these experts and created that playbook from scratch. And now that is what's being implemented at, the government is now implementing on that at a national level.
Wow. I'm amazed and exhausted just listening to you. Because how do you go from just an idea and then an experience to building a community and then an actual like huge organization that does impact work? I mean,
Mhm.
do you ever look back and say, wow, I had no idea when I started that this was where I was going? Or did
Oh,
you know all the time?
no, for sure. I had no idea. I had no idea where I was going. I had no idea where it would end up. I mean, I had called it the Oliva Project. My goal was one person. I wanted to help her. I wanted to make her life better. And what I was doing for her, other other people in Uganda said this would help me as well. So we were able to start expanding it
Mhm.
that level. I never would have imagined we would get to get to the level that we're at now, having, national policy influence. And
Yeah.
I I I know imposter syndrome is very, very real for a lot of people. I think for me, everything was happening way too fast to ever get to imposter syndrome. It
Mhm.
was just always acknowledging I have to keep learning. I have to keep learning. Okay, if we're gonna talk about inclusive education, I have to find people who are experts in this. And I have to further my education. So I was able to take postgraduate courses in Africa to learn more about the context there. And
Mhm.
thank God for online research that exists now. So I was able
Yeah.
to tap into a lot of that. You hear
But it
that.
is all very contextual too, because as you just mentioned, you kind of got dropped into a different planet. And I think one of the things that I love about your story is that your organization has really partnered with, not overshadowed or overtaken African organizations and African professionals and experts in the field. And you're helping, but they are really
Yeah,
leading,
they are
guided.
doing the work.
Yeah. There are other organizations that just kind of want to go in and tell everybody what needs to get done and how to do it. And they're
Hmm.
doing it in our style, not their style. And so I was so excited with that part of your story. Um, just the basics for people with disabilities, nothing about us without us, like same thing. You gotta reflect back on the culture in the community that you're in.
Yes, definitely. And I do have to say that was that lesson for me was a little bit of luck. There was when we first started the organization, it was a Ugandan team and myself. And there's a culture in Uganda to if you're upset about something, you don't say anything. You just keep quiet. They say you keep quiet. The team that I pulled together did not keep quiet.
Mhm.
And every Friday we would sit starting at 3 p.m. and not go home until they had aired out all of the challenges that they wanted to put forward, saying, Christa, you're coming with these ideas, or this expert from another country is coming with these ideas. We appreciate them, but we need to make this change. Or
Mm,
like, you think going into this place and doing this thing for this one kid is so helpful, but there's repercussions that we need you to be aware of, and you need to let us take care of and manage through. And having these, it was two individuals in particular, Stephen Kabenge and Hawa, who were just like, yes, and here's
yeah,
how we make it relevant to what
right.
we're going to do. And just having those two very, very strong individuals who are now the ones leading a lot of the work in Uganda. Um, I don't want to say put me in my place. They helped me understand
Right.
exactly what you said. How do we help but not input our views? Going
Right.
back to what we had started talking about, that playground experience. How do we
Yes.
keep that playground experience going, borrowing some of our ideas of inclusion, but not breaking the community that is so
Mhm.
essential to their livelihoods?
So true. Going back to that playground experience, those children, they knew what they needed from each other and they
Mhm,
provided it. You don't have to teach that really. Like
mhm,
that's just part of being human at every
mhm.
level. And we really are blessed, I think, in the disability community to be exceptionally able to hear other people's voices and
Yes.
to honor the choices that they're making. And that's uh, an exceptional approach that sort of mainstream world doesn't necessarily embrace.
Mhm.
Everybody's knows better than you do about how to do something. And if you're not a professional with a PhD in something or other, then how could you possibly know how to educate this child or how
Mhm.
to advocate for this person? So that kind of leads me to my last question for you, and then I want to check in with you on what you're doing now. Um, I'm really interested in the parents and the transformations that have come, you know, with them because as leaders in the community, it's important that they not just embrace their children and their differences and where they fit in the community, but also take that a step further and become advocates for change makers themselves.
Mhm.
So, what did you see as far as, the parents groups. I mean, you started telling me a little bit about having those meetings under the
Mhm.
mango tree. Um, but take that a step further and then tell me about the evolution of parenting.
Yeah, I remember there's one story that personally for me like hit and showcased what was really happening, and it was the girl's name was Ketty, and she had Down syndrome. She was being hidden inside the home.
Hmm.
And her mother actually found our organization, saying the community, like, I am keeping her hidden because my community thinks she's a curse on the community. They were going through a bad drought and they're trying to kill her. And I want to keep her safe. So we were able to work with her mother to reintegrate Ketty. That one took a few years to do, but I will always remember the first time Ketty went to school. She was 8 years old the first time she went into school, and we were sitting in the school office, and it had pictures on the table of, the alphabet, and her mom is just sitting next to her with their heads leaned in, touching, and she's teaching her the letters of the alphabet. And I watched it and I knew that that was the first time that they had had that kind of teaching interaction. Um, then we would go on to work on reintegrating Ketty into the community. And like you've said, her mother has actually taken on a leadership role in the community.
Yeah.
First, starting as an advocate for other mothers, she would help us with these community events to say, bring your children, this is what this is. But then she really just became, a leader in the community in general, talking about how can we create more sustainable life. This place has now been hit with several droughts and not had the same issues because her mother was there to support. And then
Mm.
we have another mother of a boy with autism who participated in this legal battle that we took on with the government. And
Oh.
there are a lot of challenges with going against the government, with bringing a complaint against them. She literally risked her life to come to the courthouse to speak up about what she needs as a mother of a child with autism in this context and to say you're not providing it. We were terrified. She was terrified. We did not know how the government was going to react to that. But
Mhm.
having that experience, it was a judge who was also a mother, and that is what clicked for her. She did not understand autism. She understood the experience of being a mother. And from this woman's story, she came to understand the need for more resources in the community to help in this care. So parents have been very, very influential. And actually, as we're moving forward, we are going to be we're trying to build up 300 parents into support groups in the next year, specifically for this reason. We know equipping the parents with skills for advocacy,
Yes.
knowing what they need and what they can ask for. They had no idea what they could ask for.
Mhm.
That's what's going to be what sustains this national level change. So
Mhm.
have developed trainings and are putting in place parent support groups to really push this out and put it into the hands of the parents. In addition to the organizations, we'll still develop the capacity of organizations, but at some point you have to go beyond what an organization
Right.
can do and a service provider can do, and you have to give the power to the parents
Absolutely.
through knowledge and awareness and education
And the individuals themselves as
and the
well.
individuals. Yes,
I
yes.
knew that's where you were going to be going with this story. I have goosebumps. I just love it. I love it because those parents will embrace other parents and continue the leadership and the training all the way down the line. The very first experience that I had with advocacy, despite having a law degree, was going to a parent training
Mhm.
and having other parents just teach me the ropes and tell our stories and share our journeys. And just there's several women in that program from literally almost 30 years ago now, that I just will never forget, because they really changed my life and my kids' life. And it's amazing what you'll do then to pay that forward. I
Mhm.
love it. Okay. So I've obviously run over on time, like I always do when I'm having an interesting conversation with somebody. Krista, what would you say to a young Krista, someone like you who has an idea, has a passion, and doesn't know where to start or what to do? Doesn't have to be Africa, could be something totally different, like teaching kids to swim or sail or travel the country. Who knows? Whatever it is.
Yes, the two things I would say, especially to myself back then, ask for help.
Mm,
Find someone who knows more than you, because there's a million people out there, and ask them what they would do. And then try it. Just give it a try. And if this thing doesn't work, then you
yeah.
move to that thing. And it doesn't have to be this. I didn't have a 10-year plan when I started. I didn't say this is what we were going to do. I said, this is what we're going to try tomorrow. So just always, always asking for advice and help
Yeah.
from the people that starting with the people you know. I think a big challenge I ran into was, who do I ask? And
Mm,
I didn't realize how many connections the people I was already connected to had. So
right.
starting there and just saying, I need help. You might not be the right person, but you can get me to the right person.
Yeah.
And then trying it. And if it doesn't
Everybody,
work, it doesn't work.
yeah, everybody's afraid to fail. Everybody thinks that, well, I need to know somebody famous to be able to get this going. I need to have, 5 million TikTok followers or whatever. You don't
Hmm.
need all of that. You
No.
just need to start. You just need to do something. And
Hmm.
that something may lead you to the next something, and so on and so on. And Krista, you are just a shining example of that. And look at what your idea has done with not alone, obviously, with an entire, country behind you and your tiny little town of Holliston. I love that story. And I think it's amazing that they still are supporting and helping, and that your organization has grown so much. This is so great. Thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us all
Oh,
about this experience.
this was wonderful. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and huge thank you to all of your listeners, who, again, just being in the community, being in the family. I understand the struggles that you're going through, and I just appreciate what you do every single day.
And if anybody is moved to get involved with Embrace Culture or anything else that Krista's doing, I'm going to have all the contact information in our show notes so that you can jump on board and either donate some time or just learn more about it. So, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. I told you this podcast was going to be easy and fun. Now you can do
It
more.
definitely was. It definitely was.
And thank you, everybody. Thank you to our listeners who really enjoy this type of show and this type of story. I have the best job in the whole world, that I get to meet the most amazing, interesting people who are doing the coolest stuff. I can't even tell you how grateful I am that this is my life right now. This is so awesome. All right. Well, listen, Krista, thank you. I'm glad we finally got this scheduled. Have a great night.
Thank you so much.